On this channel, we have had the opportunity to visit several different military cemeteries. We've, walked amongst the crosses and the Stars of David at the Normandy American Cemetery, and also while in Normandy went to the Commonwealth cemeteries and the German cemeteries. We've been to the memorials and the headstones there in Arlington, also Henri Chapelle and Jefferson Barracks on the Mississippi River. While each one of those cemeteries have their own unique qualities, one thing that they all have in common is that behind each name etched in stone, there's a story. Right now, we are on the island of Oahu in Hawaii at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which is more commonly called the Punchbowl Cemetery. This is located in the crater of an ancient volcano. The Hawaiians had a lot of different names for this place, but the most common name was the Hill of Sacrifice. So today, we're going to kind of be exploring the Punchbowl Cemetery here and looking at some of the stories behind these names etched in stone. We're starting off here at the Honolulu Memorial, which overlooks the cemetery here. And you can see that overlooking this cemetery is a statue of Lady Columbia, and she is standing on the bow of the ship, and she's holding a laurel in her left hand, and she is supposed to represent all of the grieving mothers who lost sons in the war. And down below, they have a section of Abraham Lincoln's letter to Mrs. Bigsby, which says, "The solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom." So she's overlooking all of these young men who lost their lives here in the war. And then elsewhere in the memorial, if we kind of look around here, well, it lists, or in the wall is etched the names of the major campaigns of the Pacific War. Here's something that they've done up here at the memorial that I really like. So the first men to be interred here at the cemetery fought and died in the Pacific campaign. So one thing that they do here is they tell you the story from beginning to end of what happened in the Pacific in the fight against the Japanese. So here we're kind of looking at a big picture view showing the major movements. And then take a look at this. As we move along, well, it shows the Japanese expansion and the American pushback, and then it starts going into the individual battles and telling the story of what happened. So here you have something on the Battle of Coral Sea, also the Battle of Midway. We move along and they have a large map on New Guinea and the Solomons. Okay, then we go on to the Battle of Attu, okay, one of the battles that was actually fought on American soil. Okay, we have Tarawa, Kwajalein. We move on down here a little further and it gets to the Marianas campaign with Operation Forager, where we invaded the islands of Saipan and Guam and Tinian. We're actually going to be going to those islands and learning a little bit more. And then it continues on, down through here, like to the Philippines and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But it's funny to think that, people 1,000 years from now might come to this place and come to this, what will then be a very old cemetery, and can read these panels and learn the stories of the men who were buried here. Right now, I am in Section A of the cemetery, where in January of 1949, the very first interments were made here at the Punchbowl Cemetery. And I was going to show the very first grave. It was an unknown soldier, sailor, or Marine, and the location would have been right here. Well, as you can see, there is an empty spot now. That is because recently DNA testing revealed who this individual actually was. Now, I don't know the identity at this time, but the remains have been disinterred, and the family had them removed from this cemetery. But as this cemetery was being prepared, the remains of servicemen from all over the Pacific Theater were brought to this location. So that would have been like from, Wake Island and Midway and different places like that. And the first interments were made in 1949. Now, without question, one of the most famous war correspondents of World War II was a guy by the name of Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle started reporting on the Second World War during the Battle of Britain and ended up following the U.S. forces through Africa and Italy. He reported on the Normandy invasion, and it got to be a little bit too much for him, and he had to take some time off. He ended up taking about a year off from his work, and then ended up getting back in the game and started reporting on the war in the Pacific. One of the things that made Ernie Pyle so popular amongst the American public, and especially the soldiers, is that he was very passionate about telling the story of the individual soldier. So to be mentioned in one of Ernie Pyle's stories was a really big deal. And this is a guy who really carried the weight of the war on his shoulders. And unfortunately, during the Battle of Okinawa, he was killed by a sniper's bullet on April 18th, 1945. And here is his final resting place here at the Punchbowl Cemetery. And this was devastating to the soldiers. As a matter of fact, there was a monument that was erected where he was killed. And it says, "At this spot, the 77th Infantry Division lost a buddy, Ernie Pyle, 18th of April, 1945. And Ernie Pyle was one of the first to be interred here at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. Here, just a few graves down from Ernie Pyle, is the grave of Ellison Onizuka. It says Colonel, U.S. Air Force, and this is not a World War II grave, but as you can see, it says Astronaut, Challenger, Congressional Space, Medal of Honor. Ellison Onizuka was one of the astronauts in the Challenger tragedy. This happened on January 28th, 1986. A lot of people have the incorrect assumption that the astronauts on the Challenger were vaporized in the explosion, and that's not true. There are some of them buried in different locations, Arlington being one of them. But there's a hypothesis that some of them may have even been alive whenever the remains of the Challenger fell to the ocean, but it's probably more likely that they died on the descent due to a lack of oxygen. But anyway, here is the grave of Ellison Onizuka. Something that I'm seeing a lot of here are the graves of men who served in the 442nd Infantry Regiment. This was a Japanese-American unit that fought in Italy and France, one of the most highly decorated regiments in the entire war. And so here's the grave of an individual named Hiroshi Yamaji. Looks like he died in 1949. And right next to him is Akira Yamaji, who served in both World War II and Korea, and was also in the 442nd, and was wounded in one of those conflicts. So here's a set of brothers that were in one of the most famous regiments of the entire Second World War. Oh, you might also notice that there's a cross here and kind of this wheel here. Well, this obviously denotes that this man was a Christian. The wheel is something that you don't see a lot of in other cemeteries. That denotes that he was a Buddhist. Here's another grave that is really close to Ernie Pyle. This is the grave of Burton C. Sayer from New York. And you can see he was in the 10th Marines, 2nd Marine Division, and died on July 7th of 1944. That would have put him being killed during the Battle of Saipan, but look at this. Right next to him is Ronald W. Sayer from New York, private in the 382nd Infantry, killed October 22nd, 1944. So this is a set of brothers who were both killed during the war, who now rest next to each other. Right here in the middle of the cemetery, we have the grave of Thomas James Reeves, and as you can see below his name it says Medal of Honor, and he was killed on December 7th, 1941. Reeves was on board the USS California, which was the southernmost battleship on Battleship Row. And in his Medal of Honor citation it says, after mechanized ammunition hoists were put out of action on the USS California, Reeves, on his own initiative, in a burning passageway, assisted in the maintenance of the ammunition supply by hand to the anti-aircraft guns until he was overcome by smoke and fire, resulting in his death. And for his heroic actions that day, Reeves was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But his actions did a lot to keep the guns going there on the California on December 7th. And he rests next to an unknown soldier, sailor, or Marine. On this trip, we've been talking quite a bit about the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the evening of December 7th, there was a tragic situation that took place. 6 F-4F Wildcats had taken off from the USS Enterprise to try and locate the Japanese fleet. Well, at the end of the day, they were coming back. It was getting a little bit too dark. So instead of landing on the carrier, these 6 pilots were diverted back to Pearl Harbor. And as they were coming in to land, there was a tragic miscommunication. And of course you have a bunch of guys who have been attacked earlier in the day. They're a little bit on edge. And somebody opened fire on these men as they were landing. And once one shot went off, all hell broke loose. and everybody started firing on these poor guys, thinking that they were being attacked by the Japanese again. 5 of the planes ended up being shot down, and 3 of the airmen were killed, and 2 of them are buried right here in this cemetery. Now, the very first naval aviator killed in World War II was Herbert Menges, and his wingman was this individual right here. This is Francis Hebel. So he was one of the aviators who was killed in that friendly fire incident. And man, I just can't even imagine. That is tragedy compiled on top of tragedy. And for the men who were firing on those U.S. airplanes as they were coming in, I can't even imagine how bad they must have felt after they found out that it was one of their own. And of course you can see the date of death there, December 7th, 1941. So tragic. All right, and here is the grave of another one of those airmen who was shot down by friendly fire on December 7th. This is Eric Allen. Now, Eric Allen managed to bail out, but tragically was hit with gunfire as he was parachuting down to the surface. And of course, again, you can see the date of death there, December 7th. But man, such a tragic incident. Now, here is a man who you may or may not have heard of before. This is the grave of Wilford Holmes. You can see he was born in 1900, and he was in naval intelligence. He was kind of in the department of breaking Japanese codes. Well, in May of 1942, naval intelligence knew that the Japanese were planning an attack at a spot that was codenamed AF, but they didn't know where AF was. So Holmes had the idea of faking a water supply failure at Midway and sending out an unencrypted emergency warning. Well, the Japanese picked that up and responded, and it was at that point that military intelligence was able to figure out that the Japanese were planning an attack at Midway. So old Wilford Holmes could very well be called the hero of Midway, and for his actions he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. And yeah, this is his grave. Here is the grave of Grant Timmerman, and we can see his date of death is July 8th, 1944. He was in the 6th Marine Regiment of the 2nd Marine Division and was killed on the island of Saipan, which we are going to be going to later on. But as you can see, right there in the upper right-hand corner denotes that Grant Timmerman was a recipient of the Medal of Honor. So you can look up his citation and learn a little bit more about his story. He fought at Tarawa and was killed at Saipan. I was just walking along here and happened upon the grave of Joseph Sarnosky, who was also a recipient of the Medal of Honor. He was a second lieutenant in the Army Air Forces and died June 16th, 1943. So we can all look up his Medal of Honor citation too and see what heroic deeds he performed in the Pacific War. Boy, I just keep coming across these graves that are etched in gold, denoting that the one laid to rest here was awarded the Medal of Honor. This is Anthony D'Amato, and if you look at his Medal of Honor citation, you can see he was killed on February 19th, 1944. He was killed on the Marshall Islands and was in a foxhole with 2 other Marines whenever a Japanese soldier flung a grenade in amongst them, and he selflessly flung his own body on the grenade to protect the lives of his fellow Marines, and he's laid to rest right here. As we're walking these cemetery grounds, There are a lot of men here who died at Iwo Jima, which was one of the most violent battles of the Pacific War. And one of the men who was killed there was Henry Oliver Hansen. Now, the Battle of Iwo Jima gave us one of the most enduring images of the Pacific War, with the flag raising at Iwo Jima. People may not know that there were actually two flags that were raised on Mount Suribachi. The first flag was a smaller one, and the image that we all are familiar with is the second flag, which was a larger one. Well, Henry Oliver Hansen was originally credited as being one of the flag raisers in the iconic photo from Joe Rosenthal. He was said to be at the base. Well, he ended up actually being one of the flag raisers for the first flag that went up, and he was killed 6 days later on March 1st. The man who was actually the flag raiser that Hansen was credited as being was Harlan Block. And since then, there have been two others from that second flag raising who have been misidentified. Originally, John Bradley and Renee Gagnon were said to have been two of the flag raisers, but it turns out that they were not. But anyway, here's the grave of Henry Oliver Hansen, one of the flag raisers of the first flag at Iwo Jima. We're walking through Section C of the cemetery here. And in the shade of this tree, well, we have the grave of George Ham Cannon. And as you can see, George Cannon was a recipient of the Medal of Honor. And if we take a little bit closer look, you can see the date of his death is December 7th, 1941. George Cannon was a Marine who was stationed on Wake Island, and when the Japanese attacked, he was hit with enemy shell fire and was mortally wounded, but remained at his post and refused to be evacuated until the others who were also wounded by that shell fire were taken care of, and then further refused to be evacuated until communications was restored. He later died from loss of blood. But George Ham Cannon would be the very first Marine to be awarded the Medal of Honor in World War II. Now, whenever you fly into Honolulu, you're going to fly into an airport that is named after this man right here. This is Daniel Inouye, and he fought in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And as you can see, his name is in gold, indicating that he is a recipient of the Medal of Honor. So on April 21st of 1945, he was part of an assault on the Gothic Line in Italy, and he and his team were assaulting a machine gun nest. He ended up getting hit several times. Was hit in the stomach, and also was grievously wounded in the arm, which caused it to later be amputated. But for his actions there that day, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Interesting story, whenever he was recovering in the hospital, he met another individual who was serving in Italy and who had been wounded and lost the use of his arm, and that was Bob Dole. And it was from Bob Dole that Inouye got the inspiration to get into politics, and ended up becoming a long-serving member of, he was first in Congress. He was the first congressman from Hawaii, and then was a long-serving senator. But yeah, here is the grave of Daniel Inouye, and there it says, son of Hawaii. In one of the earlier episodes on this trip, whenever I was at Pearl Harbor, there's one really well-known story that you may have noticed that I left out, and that is the story of Doris Miller. This is a man who served as a cook on the USS West Virginia, and on the morning of December 7th, helped a lot of wounded sailors in the attack, and ended up manning an anti-aircraft gun and taking down several Japanese planes. Doris Miller became the very first black man to be awarded the Navy Cross. What some people may not realize about Doris Miller is that he would not survive the war. Right now I'm standing in the Courts of the Missing here at the Honolulu Memorial, and etched in these walls are the names of all of the soldiers, sailors, and Marines who were either missing in action or lost at sea in the Pacific campaign of World War II. Well, Doris Miller found himself on an escort carrier known as the Liscum Bay after he served on the West Virginia, and in November of 1943 his ship was hit by a Japanese submarine during the campaign at the Gilbert Islands, and the carrier went down and Doris Miller went down with it. So here we can see his name etched in this wall, along with the names of over 28,000 other servicemen who never made it home.